This program is proudly brought to you by Telecom Limited and Daytech.
Good night, Papua New Guinea. I'm Malcolm Waira, and welcome to another episode of Infocus. Now, from foreign exchange issues to inflation and the devaluation of the PNG Kina, the current state of the economy has been a topical issue in recent times. Tonight, we are joined by the International Monetary Fund country head in PNG, Mr. Sorab Rafiq. Mr. Rafiq, thank you for joining us. From the outset, Mr. Rafiq, to what extent is transparency and accountability a key requirement for IMF support to governments and central banks?
It's a big part of the sort of IMF-supported program. So a couple of things on that. Our role here at the IMF, we're only here to advise and help with the government's homegrown reform agenda. This is what the IMF program is essentially here to do. Now, as part of that, transparency is very, very important. Why is it important? Because at the IMF, what we do is we make economic forecasts on GDP, inflation, we look at the country's fiscal position, and all that requires the government to provide us with timely economic data so we can make an assessment of where we are. What is happening to the economy, what are the risks to the economy, and so on. The other point that I'll make is that key part of the IMF program is improving governance and transparency. So the program has been running for just over a year now. If you look at what has happened in that time, the ICAC has appointed commissioners and deputy commissioners. It has received a significant increase in funding. If you look at sort of the COVID procurement contracts, this was a condition under the IMF program to be published. Those have been published as well. And we're also working with the central bank to help improve their economic statistics and also sort of, in more subtle ways to improve governance and transparency. So we're going to introduce an FX auction system. So we're going to be moving sort of the way that the central bank auctions its foreign exchange is going to be more based on market mechanisms. That improves transparency, which in turn improves governance. So there are many ways in which the IMF program is improving the governance and transparency, and it's a central pillar of the IMF-supported program.
Speaking of the IMF program, under the IMF Extended Credit Facility and Fund Facility Financing Program 2023 to 2026. What are its main objectives?
So, three key objectives under the program. So, the program is for 3 years. Under the financing regime, the money is released every 6 months, conditional on a review being successfully completed. The financing is very concessional, and it is very cheap. So, for example, the IMF financing is at an interest rate of 2.8%. If Papua New Guinea was tomorrow to go to the international capital markets and try and borrow, it would be borrowing at a significantly higher rate than that. So our financing is very concessional. It provides the government with some breathing room to undertake the necessary reforms that are necessary. And what are those reforms under the IMF program? The first is budgetary repair. So that is to ensure that the government's fiscal position remains on a sound and sustainable footing. That's pillar number one. Pillar number two is to deal with the FX shortages and to modernize the operations of the central bank. And then the third pillar, which is what I touched upon earlier, is to do with governance and transparency and try and sort of work across government agencies to try and improve the transparency and governance of their operations.
I understand the funding comes with conditions in the form of structural benchmarks and quantitative targets.
Yeah.
And the government targets for the government and BPNG, which they must meet to qualify for each tranche of funds to be drawn.
Yeah.
Could you highlight for them what they are?
Yeah, so I mean, those are the three broad buckets that I spoke about: budgetary repair, modernizing the operations of the central bank and dealing with the FX shortages, and finally, transparency and governance. Now, there are two types of targets that we set. The first are what are called quantitative targets. These are basically targets on the government's fiscal deficit, right? The government has to ensure that its fiscal deficit is below a certain amount. Or there could be a target, for example, on the amount of foreign exchange that the central bank has to provide the market each month. These are what are called quantitative targets. Then on the other side, we have what are called structural benchmarks. These structural benchmarks are policy reform measures, and they are more associated with, for example, sort of undertaking policy reform. So just to give you an example of this, one of the policy reform measures that was done was ICAC had to appoint a commissioner and 2 deputy commissioners. That was achieved. Another structural benchmark was the central bank has to develop a roadmap to try and deal with the FX shortages. Now, credit to the central bank under the leadership of the new central bank governor, Ms. Kenya, that target was achieved as well. And so there are many targets, 10 to 12 targets, and these are reviewed each month. And once they are completed, then another set of benchmarks are put into place, and new timelines are sort of introduced. And so the program is reviewed every 6 months. Once those benchmarks are met, if the quantitative targets are met as well, then the next tranche of money is dispersed.
So far, how has the national government in PNG performed in that regard?
So we had an IMF team in town, a very large team. They left yesterday. There was an agreement on the second review mission. So far the program has been running for just over a year. There was a first review mission after 6 months. Now there's the second review mission. An agreement was reached. The program performance has been broadly satisfactory. All quantitative targets were met. Most of the structural benchmarks were met. So far, so good. Conditional on our IMF executive board in Washington, D.C. Hopefully, if they approve, the next tranche of money will be released in July, early July.
There is quite a lot of skepticism around IMF's support to Papua New Guinea. How do you respond to such criticisms?
So we're only here to support the government's homegrown reform agenda, right? The government has its own reform agenda. We are only here to support and advise on that. Essentially, ownership of the program belongs to the government and the people of Papua New Guinea. And what our financing does is that it's, as I said at the start of this interview, it's very concessional. It's at 2.8%. There's a 5-year grace period. So it's very sort of cheap financing. And the other advantage with IMF financing is not only our money, but we also crowd in additional money. So we will get other international development institutions, maybe some other bilateral donors who will also lend to PNG because they know that an IMF program is in place. So the IMF program actually crowds in a lot of additional other financing. Now, why is this an advantage? It's because when you're undertaking reforms, you want to undertake these reforms from a position of strength. And that means if you have access to cheap financing, you can undertake reforms slowly and progressively and at a pace at which the economy and the country can withstand. Because you'd rather walk to the right solution than run to the wrong one. And that's how we are here to help.
Thank you, Mr. Rafiq. We'll go for a quick break. When we return, we discuss inflation in PNG. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Infocus. Now, Mr. Rafiq, what is the IMF's assessment of inflation in PNG?
So if you look at 2023, inflation actually was by historical standards quite low. And it was quite stable, and it was below the sort of long run historical average of 5%. So I think inflation in the mid part of 2023 it sort of fell to just over 1%. Now, historically speaking, PNG has never had inflation that low, not since independence, not since it became a free state. In recent quarters, inflation has begun to pick up, and it's around 3%, 4%. which is still quite low given the inflation performance of PNG. Now, some of that is a credit to the BPNG. Their mandate is to maintain price stability, which means low and stable inflation. So far, that has been achieved. Sort of going forward over the next few quarters, we expect to see inflation progressively rise slightly to its long-run average of around 5%.
There is a lot of skepticism, especially given that there's been differing figures regarding inflation that have been put forward by different government agencies, financial institutions, and multilateral agencies.
Yeah.
Where does the IMF draw its data from, and when computing and calculating such a key economic indicator?
Sure. So a lot of the sort of inflation data, and this not just applies to this country, but wherever we work, anywhere, we often rely on data from the National Statistics Office. So a lot of our inflation data, what we do is we look at NSO data, which is the official government data. This is what they base policy on. This is the data that is shared with us. So a lot of our analysis is actually based on this, but of course we look at other indicators as well. We look at import price inflation, which in turn is based on partner country data and trade flows with partner countries. If you look at import price inflation, that has also been very, very low in 2023, which is consistent with the low and stable inflation that was witnessed in 2023. So we look at that, and then of course we also look at global price developments. We look at global commodity prices and so on. We look at global inflation expectations. And then of course we also look at the exchange rate as well. And so we have all this sort of different data, and it's like a jigsaw, and you need to piece all that jigsaw together. And by that you can sort of formulate a view, formulate a sort of a perception of where inflation is, and gauge how accurate the official National Statistics Office data is. And so based on everything that we've seen, the low and stable inflation is sort of consistent with what we've been hearing.
Okay. What policy advice are you offering to the government to stabilize or reduce the rate of inflation?
So inflation is already, in 2023, was already very low. It's projected to rise a little bit to around 5%, which is this country's long-run historical average inflation, and that's perfectly normal. You know, the BPNG in their monetary policy statement that they issued about 10 days ago have said that they are going to begin to normalize monetary policy, and that's a sensible and prudent thing to do, given that the monetary policy rate in this country was at a historically low level, and part of that is understandable. The central bank wanted to try and support the economy after the social unrest in January and so on. But now I think it's going to begin a tightening cycle, and that's very appropriate given sort of the projections of inflation. And then, you know, it's not just an issue for monetary policy. You then need to look at fiscal policy as well. The government has very successfully been reducing the size of its fiscal deficit. It has progressively gotten smaller since the COVID pandemic, and that's a credit to the government that they have been able to achieve that. It is projected to continue getting smaller and smaller over the next few years. And so that will also help sort of contain any inflationary pressures, and that's entirely appropriate as well.
Thank you, Mr. Rafiq. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back. You're watching Infocus. Now, Mr. Rafiq, with the stagnation of wages, what can be done about it to improve the cost of living?
So that's a very important question, right? So people on the one hand talk about how the price level has been rising. And if you look at the actual data, it's been rising for many, many years, for over a decade now. I think you've asked a very important question. The question is, why hasn't household income not risen in line with the cost of living? And there's many reasons for that, but one significant reason for that is down to the fact that there have been FX shortages. What the FX shortages have done is they have significantly hampered investment spending, and they have significantly hampered the country's ability to attract foreign direct investment. Now, what does that mean? these FX shortages have essentially generated lower GDP growth. And what is the biggest determinant of driving wages and household income? It's essentially GDP growth. So if you can deal with the FX shortages, which is essentially a reflection of the fact that the Kina is overvalued, you can make a more conducive business environment, which in turn will generate more investment, which in turn will generate more GDP growth, which in turn should hopefully push up wages and household income. The final point I'll make on this is that if you look at surveys of CEOs done in Papua New Guinea, they rank for FX shortages as the single biggest impediment to their business growth in this country.
It's a good segue into our next question, and it's that one of the key reforms proposed by IMF is the devaluation of the Kina.
Yeah.
How overvalued is the PNG Kina?
So I need to take issue slightly with your question. We have never called for a devaluation in the Kina. As part of the sort of IMF supported program, what we asked the government to do is to look at the exchange rate, and we've basically, our assessment is, and I think it's the government's assessment as well, is that the Kina is overvalued. And what we asked the government to do is to sort of remove that overvaluation, because it's that overvaluation which is creating the FX shortages.
So far, how has the government and the central bank acted on that advice?
So if you look at what has happened since the start of the year, the BPNG has introduced what is called a crawl-like exchange rate regime. Now that's a significant sort of change to what went previously. So what went previously is that the Kina was essentially kept very, very stabilized against the US dollar. But if you look at what has happened since the start of the year, the exchange rate, which was overvalued, has begun to adjust and has begun to move more in line with its true market value. Now, essentially how the crawl-like regime works is that every 6 months there will be an assessment by the BPNG, and they will look at whether the Kina is undervalued or whether it's overvalued. And from that assessment, they will then determine the slope and the direction of the Kina exchange rate. And if you look at that, and if you look at since sort of the start of the year, so far the BPNG have been sort of implementing the policy.
Yes. A lot of institutions and reputable businesses based in Papua New Guinea, they don't share the stance of devaluation of the PNG Kina.
Yeah.
They have cited inflationary pressure that will emanate from the devaluation of the PNG Kina. Whilst you primarily provide advice to the national government and the Bank of Papua New Guinea, to what extent do you engage or consult local interest groups, businesses, and other multilateral institutions?
So that's a very significant part of my role here, is to always speak to the key stakeholders on the ground, to speak to NGOs, to speak to the business community. Our work is not just with the government, so that's the first point I'll make. And it's very important that I get a sense of what the views are on the ground, so I can convey those views back to Washington, and that can help inform our policy advice. You know, Papua New Guinea hasn't had an IMF representative on the ground for over 20 years. I'm the first one in over 20 years, and I'm here precisely for that reason, to gauge and to listen and to see what people's concerns are, so I can relay more accurately and in real time those concerns back to Washington, D.C. That's the first point. The second point is, as I said, the IMF has never recommended devaluation. All we've asked for is to introduce greater exchange rate flexibility. And the other thing that we've called for is our policies to begin to remove the overvaluation in the exchange rate. Because it is this overvaluation in the exchange rate that is causing the FX shortages, which in turn dampens investment spending, which in turn reduces GDP growth, which in turn pushes down wages, which in turn leads to a cost of living crisis. So if we want to deal with the cost of living crisis, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how can we begin to push up wages? How can we begin to raise household incomes? And the only way we're going to do that is through investment and higher GDP growth, which will create more jobs, which in turn will push up household incomes. And the only way we're going to achieve that is to get rid of the FX shortages. How do we get rid of the FX shortages? We remove the Kina overvaluation.
Now, what is PNG's current debt to GDP ratio based on the IMF's assessment?
So, based on official numbers, the country's debt to GDP ratio is around 50% of GDP. So it's not on the high end. If you compare it to other countries in the Asia Pacific region, it's not on the high end. It's not on the very low end. It sort of sits, not even in the middle. It sort of sits a bit on the lower end. So the country's debt is entirely sustainable. And if it wasn't sustainable, the IMF wouldn't be providing a financing program.
How has PNG performed in terms of meeting its external debt payments, especially with IMF and other multilateral institutions?
So, as I said, our financing is very cheap. It's and there's a long grace period. So, as soon as we begin lending, the country doesn't begin repaying anything back to the IMF for 5 years. And once it does begin paying back, it will be paying back at an interest rate of 2.8%. In terms of the country's meeting its external debt obligations, they haven't defaulted on any payment, and that's a credit to the government.
Mr. Sorab Rafiq, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, viewers, that's all the time we have for this edition of Infocus. Do join us again next week, Monday, on our regular time slot of 7 p.m. Till then, bye for now.
This program was proudly brought to you by Telecom Limited and Daytech.